An elderly man entered the car dealership quietly as the sounds of chatter and the hum of busy salespeople filled the air. He stepped over the threshold of the showroom, his eyes scanning the bright polished floor, reflecting the rows of shiny new cars. The latest models gleamed under the showroom lights. He was dressed in a simple sweater and slacks, his steps slow but deliberate despite his age. There was a sense of purpose in the way he carried himself. Though the hustle and bustle of the place continued around him, he seemed to move with calm certainty, not in a hurry but not distracted either. His eyes carefully examined the vehicles on display. He seemed to study every detail, as if he had all the time in the world. He stopped in front of a sleek car at the far end of the showroom, its deep black color and smooth curves catching his attention. It was a model that stood out among the others, a luxury sedan with high-end features and a price tag that could easily turn away anyone who wasn't sure of their financial standing. But the elderly man didn't seem to be daunted by the cost. His gaze held a quiet admiration for the car, but there was no rush in him. He didn't immediately call for a salesperson. Instead, he simply looked around, observing the other customers milling about the showroom as they were attended to by the young and eager salespeople. The air was filled with the sounds of enthusiastic voices discussing prices and features, test drives, and trade-ins. But none of the salespeople seemed to notice the elderly man at first. He didn't fit the typical image of someone looking for a high-end car. His clothes were modest, his hair graying, and his movements slower than those of the younger customers browsing the showroom floor. They were the ones the salespeople were more eager to approach, assuming they were ready to make a purchase that day. The elderly man took a deep breath and glanced once more at the card he had chosen to admire. The sight of it in the middle of all the glitz and glamour made it stand out even more, like a jewel among stones. But still no one seemed to approach him. He waited patiently, standing by the car, as the young salesman took note of the flashy couple who had just entered the showroom. They were dressed in brand new designer clothes and looked every bit the part of potential buyers. They were immediately met with smiles and eager offers as the elderly man quietly stood by himself and watched the interaction from afar. He didn't seem offended by the lack of attention. He simply observed the young couple as they made their way around the cars, pointing at features and discussing colors. But still the elderly man waited quietly, his gaze never leaving the luxury sedan in front of him. As the minutes passed, the salesman who had been helping the younger couple made his way toward the back of the showroom, toward the office, not paying the elderly man any attention at all. This was a scene that played out frequently in the dealership. A young and vibrant customer was always more appealing to the eager salespeople with their energy and enthusiasm, while the older customers were often overlooked or underestimated. Perhaps they were just window shopping, maybe they were only there to admire the cars. But the elderly man was not like the others. He wasn't just another passerby. He knew what he wanted, he knew what he was there for, and it was only a matter of time before he would reveal his true purpose. But for now he stood still in front of the car, his mind made up, his decision clear, and yet the salespeople continued to pass him by, oblivious to the potential in front of them. The young salesman who had been so focused on the flashy couple finally noticed the elderly man standing by the luxury car. His eyes scanned the older gentleman for a moment, taking in the simple clothes and the slow, steady movements. He didn't seem like the kind of person who would be interested in such an expensive model. The salesman dismissed him almost instantly, figuring the man was just another window shopper, someone who liked to dream, but never had any intention of buying the car. In fact, he had seen this scene play out countless times before. The elderly man was just another reminder that many people of his age didn't have the financial means to purchase high-end vehicles. The salesman had learned to spot the signs a long time ago. The elderly man didn't look like he belonged here, at least not in the context of buying a luxury car. So without a second thought, the salesman turned away and made his way toward the other end of the showroom to speak with the younger couple who were still discussing colors and features of their potential new car. The elderly man continued to stand there, looking at the car as if deep in thought, not once showing any frustration or impatience. He stood still, his gaze never wavering from the sleek vehicle before him. The salesman, in the meantime, was busy talking to the younger couple, trying to make a quick sale as the dealership was bustling with activity. The atmosphere was alive with the energy of people eager to close deals, and move on to the next customer. Meanwhile, the elderly man remained unnoticed, his presence hardly registered by the busy staff. The salesman was certain he wouldn't have to worry about the elderly man anytime soon, but the elderly man wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't here to chase a sale. He wasn't rushing towards something. Instead, he was calmly making his decision. He understood the value of time, and he knew that the car would still be there waiting for him. When he was ready, the salesman's thoughts began to drift as he worked with the younger couple in front of him. They were discussing trade-ins and potential financing options, eager to move forward and finalize the deal that the elderly man still hadn't left, and that made the salesman feel a slight twinge of curiosity. What was the old man doing still standing by the car? Why hadn't he left? Why hadn't he wandered off to another vehicle like most of the other customers? He glanced over at the elderly man for a brief moment, but quickly refocused on the couple who seemed more eager to make a purchase. He didn't want to waste his time with someone who clearly wasn't going to buy anything, but still a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the elderly man wasn't as out of place as he first appeared. Perhaps there was more to him than he was letting on. After all, some customers didn't look like they could afford much, but surprised everyone when it came time to close the deal. And yet it was too late for the salesman to reconsider his decision. He had already moved on. He had already made up his mind. The elderly man was no different than the others who wandered into the dealership looking, but never buying. So the elderly man stood there quietly, his hands resting by his sides, the gentle hum of the showroom continuing around him, as the salesman led the younger couple toward the next step in their purchase, leaving the elderly man to himself, once more undisturbed and unnoticed. But this was about to change. The elderly man was not content to be overlooked. He had come to this dealership for a reason, and when the moment was right, he would show them just how wrong they were to dismiss him. But for now, he simply waited, waiting for the right time to make his move. It was only a matter of time before the salesman would realize his mistake. The elderly man stood quietly still beside the car, his eyes never leaving the sleek lines of the luxury sedan. He had chosen to focus on the hum of the dealership around him, seemed distant, almost like a soft buzz in his ears. It was as if time itself slowed down as he took in every detail of the vehicle, the way the chrome accents gleamed in the light, the shine of the tires, the leather interior that could be seen through the windows of the showroom. He was immersed in the presence of the car, as though it was the only thing that mattered in the world. He was not rushed or nervous. His movements were deliberate and calm. Every moment felt like it was building towards something, but what that something was remained unknown, even to the salesman, who was now engaged in a lively discussion with the younger couple on the other side of the showroom. The elderly man took a moment to glance around at the other cars surrounding him. Some were flashy and bold, others were more reserved, but none seemed to command the attention that the luxury sedan did in his eyes. This was the one he had chosen, not because it was the most expensive or the most glamorous, but because it was exactly what he needed. He had come to this dealership for a reason. He had known what he wanted even before he stepped inside the building, and now all he needed was to make that clear to everyone else around him. The salesman was still distracted, his focus entirely on the younger couple discussing their trade-in options, when the elderly man took a deep breath and finally turned to face him. He had made up his mind. It was time to act without hesitation. He walked toward the salesman, who had been so preoccupied with the other customers that he hadn't even noticed the elderly man moving closer. His steps were steady and sure as he approached the young salesman, who was still talking to the couple and smiling in that way that salespeople do when they are trying to close a deal. The elderly man stood beside him and cleared his throat, politely catching the attention of the salesman. For the first time, the young man turned his head and raised an eyebrow, surprised to see the elderly man standing there. His face was slightly puzzled, as though he couldn't understand why the man had approached him after being ignored for so long. The elderly man smiled warmly at the salesman without saying a word. For a moment, the salesman just stood there, unsure of how to respond to the older man's calm demeanor. It was a stark contrast to the eagerness he had seen from the other customers moments before. Then the elderly man spoke, his voice clear and steady, but not rushed. He asked to take the car for a test drive. The salesman was taken aback for a moment. He didn't expect this request from someone who had looked like he was simply admiring the vehicle from afar. He had assumed the elderly man was just another person who liked to look, but never buy. But the request caught him off guard, and his surprise was evident. His face shifted slightly to confusion, but the polite smile remained plastered on his face. He hadn't expected a request like this, especially not from someone who had so clearly been overlooked by him and the rest of the staff. But instead of turning the man away or dismissing him, the salesman hesitated for a moment, then decided to humor him. After all, he thought the man would likely just drive around for a few minutes and return with no intention to make a purchase. He motioned toward the car and handed over the keys, still trying to mask the doubt that lingered in his mind. It was a formality, a gesture that seemed more out of politeness than belief that the elderly man would actually go through with it. The elderly man took the keys without a word and turned to head toward the car he had chosen. The salesman watched him walk toward the vehicle with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He was already thinking about how he would move on to his next sale, and yet he had no idea that this seemingly ordinary moment would soon take a turn he would never have expected. The elderly man made his way to the luxury car, his movements still slow but deliberate, each step purposeful, as if he was already familiar with every inch of the vehicle. He reached the door and gently opened it, sliding into the plush leather seat. The smell of the new car was rich and inviting. But to him it was more than just a car. It was a symbol of something he had worked for all his life. With care and patience, he adjusted the seat just right before glancing over at the dashboard, taking in the sleek design and the state-of-the-art technology. It felt like a perfect fit. Despite the salesman's doubts, the elderly man seemed entirely at ease behind the wheel. As he started the engine, it hummed to life smoothly with a soft purr, and the car seemed to come alive in an instant. The salesman stood in the background watching him, with a raised eyebrow, unsure of what was happening. He had assumed the elderly man was merely taking the car for a quick spin, but what struck him was the way the man carried himself behind the wheel. He wasn't nervous or uncertain like many first-time test drivers. He was calm and confident, as if he had done this many times before. Without a second thought, the elderly man eased the car out of the parking space and drove off the lot without hesitation. The salesman watched as the car smoothly disappeared down the street, his mind now racing, wondering if he had misjudged the situation. After all, he had seen many customers come and go, but none quite like this. The elderly man drove with a sense of purpose, his hands steady on the wheel and his eyes focused on the road ahead. He wasn't rushing through the test drive. He took his time, making turns with precision, as if he was assessing the car thoroughly. He didn't need the salesman to tell him about the features or the performance. He could feel it for himself. The car responded to every command smoothly and effortlessly. It was as if the car had become an extension of himself, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the ride, to feel the freedom and power that only such a car could provide. He didn't care about the salesman's doubts or the expectations of others. This was his moment to embrace something that he had worked toward for years. The open road ahead was a reminder that dreams didn't have an expiration date, and no one could take away the satisfaction of achieving something that had long been on his mind. When the elderly man returned to the dealership, the car rolled smoothly back into the lot. The salesman was still standing by the showroom entrance, his arms crossed now. His expression was more thoughtful than before. He had been expecting a short test drive, a brief trip around the block, but the elderly man had taken his time, and he had done so with purpose. The car came to a stop, and the elderly man gently put it in park. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked back toward the showroom, his pace just as steady and deliberate as before. The salesman was silent for a moment, unsure of how to approach the situation. He had assumed the elderly man would return the car with a quick thanks and then leave without any further interaction. But this was different. Something about the elderly man's calm confidence made the salesman second guess his earlier judgment. He was no longer just another old man browsing. He had just driven the luxury sedan with ease, as though it were meant for him all along. And now the salesman couldn't ignore the fact that there was something more to this man than he had first realized. Still, the elderly man remained composed as he walked past the salesman without a word. It was clear now that this wasn't just a casual visit. He had come here for something more, and the moment of truth was about to unfold. The elderly man walked past the salesman without a glance, his steps steady and unwavering. He made his way back into the showroom, where the staff were still focused on the younger couple who were deep in conversation about financing options. No one seemed to notice the elderly man at first as he entered the showroom again. But he didn't mind. He wasn't here for their attention. He was here for something else, something they hadn't yet figured out. The salesman watched the elderly man with a mix of confusion and curiosity as he passed by, but still made no move to stop him. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was unfolding before him. The elderly man approached the desk where the salespeople had been gathering papers and discussing deals, and without saying a word he placed the keys of the car onto the counter. The soft clink of metal against wood caught the attention of one of the nearby staff members, but they didn't immediately react. They thought maybe the elderly man was simply returning the keys and ending the test drive. They didn't expect him to be ready for the next step. But then the elderly man surprised them all. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a checkbook. His fingers moved slowly but deliberately as he opened it and began to write a number across the page. The staff member who had been closest to him glanced over his shoulder and saw the elderly man writing the check, but still didn't understand what was happening. He thought maybe the man was just writing down some figures or making notes. But when the elderly man turned the checkbook toward him and handed it over, the staff member's eyes widened in shock. The elderly man had written a check for the full price of the car. The check wasn't just a down payment or a fraction of the cost, it was the entire amount. The staff member looked at the check and then back at the elderly man in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could someone like him afford such a luxury vehicle? He had assumed the elderly man was just browsing, had dismissed him as someone who couldn't possibly be a serious buyer. And yet here he was holding a check that would pay for the car in full. Without a second thought, the elderly man remained calm as ever, his expression unchanged, as if this was a routine transaction to him. He didn't show any sign of excitement or even satisfaction. He simply waited for the staff member to process the information. The dealership had clearly underestimated him, but now the elderly man was in control, and they had no choice but to acknowledge it. The salesman, who had been distracted by the younger couple, was still watching from a distance, his mind racing with questions about what had just happened. How had he missed it? How had he misjudged the elderly man so completely? He had written him off as someone who couldn't afford the car, who wasn't serious about buying. And now he was standing here witnessing the reality of the situation. The elderly man had made his purchase without hesitation, and had done so in a way that no one could ignore. The staff member hesitated for a moment before taking the check and stepping away to verify the details. He was still stunned by what he had just witnessed as the elderly man waited patiently. Not a word was spoken. The atmosphere in the showroom had shifted. Everyone now seemed aware of the quiet power that the elderly man held in this moment. No longer was he invisible or dismissed. He was a customer, a serious one at that, and the dealership had no choice but to treat him as such. The staff was still processing the unexpected turn of events. When the elderly man finally turned toward the door, he walked out calmly with the salesman trailing behind him, unsure of what to say or do next. His actions had spoken louder than words. Ever could the dealership staff watched in silence as the elderly man exited the showroom with the car keys in hand, and no one dared to interrupt him. It was clear now that they had all underestimated him, and that they would never make that mistake again. The elderly man walked calmly toward the door with the check now in hand, the car keys dangling from his fingers, his steps unhurried and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. The salesman followed behind him, still in disbelief, unsure whether to speak or simply let the elderly man leave without a word. He had never expected this. The elderly man had made his intentions clear, and now the reality of the situation was sinking in. But the salesman wasn't the only one who had noticed something had changed in the atmosphere around the dealership. The other staff members were beginning to realize what had just occurred. The once overlooked customer was now the center of attention, and the buzz in the showroom had shifted from the previous excitement of potential sales to an awkward silence. As the elderly man continued toward the exit, a few of the salespeople exchanged confused glances as they tried to process what had just happened. No one had expected him to be a serious buyer, and yet here he was making a purchase, with no fanfare, no drama, no boasting about his wealth or status, just a quiet confidence that sent ripples through the entire dealership. The elderly man reached the door and stepped outside into the bright daylight, the fresh air greeting him as he walked toward his new car parked neatly at the curb. He didn't look back, he didn't need to, he had made his point, and the staff inside were still catching up to the reality of what had just unfolded. The salesman, who had followed him outside, stood frozen for a moment, still unable to fully comprehend the turn of events. He had thought that the elderly man was just another time-waster, a casual browser who would never make a purchase. But now he stood on the sidewalk watching the man he had dismissed so easily preparing to drive away in the very car he had once thought out of his league. It wasn't just the amount of money the elderly man had spent that shocked the salesman. It was the way he had done it, with such ease and certainty. He had arrived unnoticed and left without any fanfare. No one had seen it coming. And now the salesman could only watch as the elderly man got into the car and turned the key. The engine started up with a smooth hum as the man adjusted his seat and checked the mirrors before putting the car in gear and driving away. The salesman stood there for a moment longer before the reality of the situation hit him like a wave. He had underestimated the elderly man. He had let his assumptions cloud his judgment, and now he had to live with the knowledge that he had missed the opportunity to treat this customer with the respect he deserved all along. He watched the luxury car disappear down the road as the rest of the dealership fell into an eerie silence. No one knew what to say, no one knew how to react. It was as if the entire showroom had been reset, and the roles of who was important had been flipped on their head. The elderly man had turned the tables in a way that no one could have predicted. He had arrived overlooked and dismissed, and now he had driven away with a purchase no one had expected. And in doing so he had shown everyone inside the dealership that appearances could be deceiving, that a person's worth couldn't always be judged by their age or their clothes or their first impression. No one would ever forget this day, and the elderly man's quiet act of defiance would echo in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it for a long time to come. As the elderly man drove away, the reality of the moment continued to sink in at the dealership. The staff, who had been so focused on their sales, had suddenly found themselves in an uncomfortable silence. The showroom, which had once been filled with the sounds of discussions and negotiations, now felt still and uncertain. No one quite knew what to say or do after the elderly man's departure. The salesman, who had been closest to him, stood at the doorway watching the car disappear down the road, his mind racing in circles trying to process what had just happened. He had seen many customers in his time, but never one like that. His thoughts were a mixture of disbelief and regret. How had he not seen it? How had he allowed his assumptions to cloud his judgment? He had assumed the elderly man was just another tire kicker, someone who would waste his time and walk away empty-handed. But instead, he had witnessed a man who knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it. The same realization was spreading throughout the dealership as the other salespeople looked at each other, unsure of how to react. They had all been so focused on the flashy customers, the ones who looked like they were ready to spend big, that they had missed the quiet presence of the elderly man who had been standing in their midst the entire time. And now that he was gone, they were left with a sense of discomfort, like they had somehow missed an opportunity that they would never get back. The dealership was a place where first impressions mattered the most, and the elderly man had taught them all a lesson in humility. His actions had sent a ripple through the showroom that no one could ignore. He had turned the tables on them all without ever raising his voice or demanding attention. It had been a simple, quiet act, but one that carried far more weight than anyone had anticipated. As the staff began to regain their composure, the manager of the dealership stepped forward, a man who had been in the business for decades and who prided himself on his ability to read people. He had seen the elderly man's entrance and had made the same snap judgment as the rest of the staff, assuming the man wasn't a serious buyer. But as the manager stood there processing the situation, he realized just how wrong they had all been. The elderly man had proven that looks could be deceiving and that a person's worth couldn't be judged by their age or appearance. It was a humbling moment for the entire team. The manager turned to the salesman who had been closest to the elderly man, still standing in the doorway. With a distant look in his eyes, he could tell that the young man was still in shock, still processing what had just happened. He took a deep breath and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. He didn't say anything at first, but the message was clear: we all make mistakes, and this one was a big one. The salesman nodded slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment, and regret he had misjudged the elderly man in a way that could not be undone. It was a mistake he would carry with him for a long time. But it was also a lesson one he would never forget. The manager looked around at the rest of the staff, who were still trying to wrap their heads around what had just happened. His gaze was steady and firm. As he addressed them all, it was clear that the lesson was one they all needed to learn. This wasn't just about a sale or a commission. It was about respect. It was about understanding that every customer, regardless of their age, their appearance, or their background, deserved the same level of attention and consideration, and that assumptions based on stereotypes could lead to missed opportunities and lost sales. It was a lesson that no one at the dealership would forget anytime soon. As the day wore on, the dealership returned to its usual rhythm. Customers came and went, cars were sold, and deals were made, but the memory of the elderly man remained with the staff, a quiet reminder of the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, no matter who they were or how they appeared. And while the elderly man had driven away from the dealership that day, he had left behind a legacy that would last far longer than any sale ever could. The days following the elderly man's purchase seemed to pass in a blur at the dealership. The memory of what had happened lingered in the air like a heavy fog, and no one could quite shake the feeling that they had missed something important. The lessons learned were still fresh, but they weren't easily forgotten. And every time a new customer walked through the door, the staff couldn't help but wonder if they might be making the same mistake again. They found themselves taking a little more time with each person, a little more patient, a little more aware of the assumptions they might have been making without even realizing it. The salesman who had been closest to the elderly man was particularly affected. He had thought he knew how to read people. After all, he had been working at the dealership for years and had seen countless customers walk through the door, but the elderly man had proven him wrong, and in doing so had shown him that appearances could be deceiving, and that people weren't always what they seemed to be. The salesman had spent nights reflecting on the encounter, wondering why he had overlooked the man in the first place. He had let his assumptions get in the way of doing his job properly, and now he understood just how dangerous that could be. He began to approach each customer with a new sense of humility and open-mindedness, determined to never make the same mistake again. The manager of the dealership also felt the weight of what had happened. It had been a long time since he had seen such a clear example of the importance of treating everyone with respect. He had prided himself on being able to read people, but the elderly man had shown him that no one could truly be judged based on their appearance or their age. It was a powerful lesson, and one that had changed the way he approached his work. He made sure to pass this lesson on to the rest of the staff, reminding them all that every person who walked through their doors was worthy of the same level of attention and care, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. In the months that followed, the dealership's sales improved, but not because they had suddenly found the secret to closing more deals. It was because they had changed their approach. They had begun to see people as individuals, not as types or categories, and that made all the difference. The elderly man's visit had left a lasting impact on the entire team, and they carried that lesson with them. As they interacted with customers every day, the word about the elderly man and his unexpected purchase spread beyond the dealership, and soon people in the community were talking about it. They spoke of how the man had shown the dealership what true value meant, and how his quiet dignity had humbled everyone who had witnessed the event. The story became a reminder that respect wasn't something that could be earned based on outward appearances, but something that was due to everyone from the moment they stepped into the door. It was a story that resonated deeply with those who heard it, and it inspired others to take a closer look at how they treated people in their own lives. The elderly man's visit had become a legend of sorts, a story that would be told for years to come. And it had done more than just change the way the dealership operated. It had touched something deeper in the hearts of those who had been involved in that moment. It had reminded them of the importance of kindness, the power of humility, and the value of every person they met. No one at the dealership would ever forget the lesson they had learned, and as time went on, they found themselves carrying that lesson into every interaction. They had treating each customer with the same care and respect, no matter who they were or what they appeared to be, because they knew now that you never really knew who might walk through your door, and you never knew when someone's quiet strength might turn the tables in a way that changed everything.